Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn. It's a new year, and I want to spend some time talking to some of the leaders of my favorite legal charities and what they did in 2021, as well as what they're looking forward to in 2022. Today's guest is the Executive Director of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Joanna Baron. The CCF is a legal charity that I work for as well, and I'm really excited for this conversation about what we've achieved and what to expect in the coming year. I am so passionate about the work that we do at the CCF. We're involved in some of the most significant and novel constitution cases in Canada. We've been involved in cases about property rights, security of person and medical choice, about freedom of expression, and about COVID restrictions. With 2 years into the pandemic, we're now seeing even more of them. Joanna, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm just thrilled to be having this conversation. Let's start off by, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you got involved in the Canadian Constitution Foundation and Liberty Movement?
Well, I'll try to be really brief because the story actually involves you, if you'll remember. I was a criminal defense lawyer working for Eddie Greenspan, the late, great Eddie Greenspan. And when he passed away, the business of the firm was not really going to continue. And at the time, I met up with you for coffee. You used to live around King Street East. Hope we can say that. And you were telling me that you worked for a charity and that it was the most meaningful, motivating thing, that you woke up every day. I remember you said to me, you woke up every day excited to work because it was such meaningful work for you. And you said, and there's another great charity that's hiring right now. And it was the Canadian Constitution Foundation, which I'd never heard of. And I read about them and learned about the freedom movement work that they do, which is very consonant with my own values as a grandchild of Holocaust survivors who has always been skeptical of state overreach and state power. And I applied. I started with the Runnymede Society, which is CCF's educational project in the law schools. I built that up and sort of launched it from an idea to a nationwide law student movement that's pro-liberty and viewpoint diversity and things like that. And then in April of 2019, when my former boss, Howard Anglin, moved on, I was invited to apply for the role of executive director. And I've been doing this ever since, and got you to come on and join me full circle just over a year ago, or I guess a year and a half ago now.
Yeah, I remember that dinner that we had on King Street, and I did have my dream job. I was working for a different organization called Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And when you called me to ask if I wanted to join the CCF, I said the only thing that could make me leave my dream job is another dream job. And I still feel that way. I still wake up every day so excited and invigorated to do the work that we do at CCF, which I think almost no organizations in Canada do the type of work that we do. And I'm so excited that we get to work together as well. So for our viewers who might not know as much about the CCF, what can you tell us about the organization's mission? What are the goals of CCF?
Yeah, so our mission is to protect and defend constitutional liberties in courts of law and public opinion. So obviously the main function of what we do is sue the government when they violate your rights, but we also recognize that part of advancing a culture of liberty comes with hearts and minds, and we're particularly passionate about empowering everyday Canadians to understand that the Constitution is a document that pertains to them. There are limits on how far the government can go and intrude on your liberties. And maybe we'll talk about it a little later, some specific projects we have this year. So Canadians really understand that they have this toolbox, that there is this thing called the Constitution, which is a document that serves them.
So one of the things we do, as you mentioned, is we do sue the government. We stand between individuals and oppressive state action, and we're often their only option for help. But some of these cases are really a little quirky and odd, and how do we find them? How do we get involved? Why don't you flesh that out for our viewers a little bit?
Yeah, so it can be in various ways. So often the way that we'll pick a new case is we'll literally see it in the media. That was the case with our newest case with the flag sign, which I'm sure we'll speak about.
Yeah, we'll get into that.
We just sort of will see funny things going on, and we kind of have an eye that's trained. Like I remember there was a bizarre case about an ad an Anglophone rights group had put up an ad on a New Brunswick bus. And an ordinary Canadian might read that and think, oh, that's kind of bizarre. But we would read that and be like, that's a freedom of expression problem. And how's New Brunswick justifying telling a private group to take down their ad, no matter what we think of the content? So often it's that. In terms of the more theoretical.
Joanna, we've got to go to commercial break, but let's continue this conversation right after. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're talking to Joanna Baron from the Canadian Constitution Foundation. It's the same charity that I work for. And we're talking about some of the work that the CCF's done in the last year. And we just finished the last segment off talking about where we find our cases. And I'm involved in a lot of that as well. I often look at cases that have gotten leave from the Supreme Court, at the Court of Appeal, really interesting and novel cases. But one of the other ways we get cases is people will reach out to us directly. Why don't you tell us about that as well, Joanna?
Yeah, so people can reach out to us through our website, theccf.ca. And we've actually, gotten in touch with people with some very meritorious cases that way, so nothing is really too small. As I mentioned, some of our most interesting cases have really been at the municipal level, as you know.
Now, one of the things that we do is these what's called interventions at the Supreme Court, which is kind of appearing as a friend of the court to help the court develop law, develop understanding of the law in areas that might be broader than what the parties to a case are arguing. And there were two cases last year that we were involved in at the Supreme Court level. One was a case called Ward, which involved a Quebec comedian, and the other was a case involving the city of Toronto. Why don't you tell us about the Ward case and the CCF's role in that one?
So the Ward case involved a comedian who made an admittedly distasteful joke about a disabled child.
Admittedly by us. I don't know, admittedly by him.
Admittedly by us. He did kind of later say I was a jerk for saying that, which the Supreme Court quoted against him. But the point is that the state fined him $40,000 in moral damages against the child. And we just felt that once you get the state getting into the very gray zone area of when dark comedy goes too far, it is just an unjustifiable breach of freedom of expression. And luckily, a majority of the court agreed with us.
Yeah, that was a great case for freedom of expression, although I have to admit I was a bit distraught to see how close it ultimately was at the Supreme Court. Now, there was another case we were involved in at the Supreme Court level involving the city of Toronto and some legislation that the provincial government in Ontario had passed reducing the size of Toronto City Council. And can you tell us a little bit about what that case was about and what the CCF's role was in that case?
Yeah, so the bare facts are that the Constitution, the Charter, does not protect municipal elections. It explicitly protects provincial and federal elections. And so the judge at the trial court instance was trying to kind of shoehorn different rights into shoehorn a freedom of expression right that he couldn't find in the written text of the Constitution. And so our position was that not in defense of what Doug Ford did necessarily, but that the proper remedy for that has to be to vote out Doug Ford or vote out the politician rather than allow a judge to read in basically whatever they want to see in the Constitution. So that was really a rule of law and predictability case for us.
And ultimately the court sided with the arguments that we were making as an intervener and with the province. One of the other cases I wanted to talk about quickly is one that involved election speech and censorship of election speech for what the federal government was calling false information. We brought this case ourselves as a public interest litigant in Ontario, challenging the law, and we won. What can you tell us about that case and what it means for freedom of expression in Canada?
Yeah, so the government had brought in this legislation which proposed hefty fines, even jail time for innocent disseminations of false information about various categories about politicians or people associated with a political party. And we just said, this is vague. It could catch somebody innocently retweeting a statement about, for example, Justin Trudeau and SNC-Lavalin. It's going to catch people with no mens rea, no mental element. And it was an interesting hearing. As you know, the government tried to say that the law didn't allow that, but the judge just didn't buy it. It was just very clear from how the law had been amended that it would catch innocent misstatements. And so she struck it down in February 2021. And we are happy to say that the government said they do not intend to seek leave to appeal. So that law has made political expression freer in Canada.
I mean, it was such a terrible law. It would have captured someone who said something like Andrew Scheer was an insurance broker, which we've subsequently found out, I guess he wasn't an insurance broker. He just worked in an insurance office, but it was false speech. But it didn't matter if you believed it was true for whatever reason. If you said it and it was false, you could actually be subject to pretty hefty penalties. I think, as you said, $50,000 and even some jail time for making a really simple and common mistake. So that was a really great result for freedom of expression. When we come back from this commercial break, I want to talk about what we have on the horizon for some new cases. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where I'm chatting with Joanna Baron about what work the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the same charity I work for, has been doing this last year and what we're looking forward to this year. Now, before we turn to what is on the horizon for 2022, I know what we get emails about all the time are what work are we doing, what work have we done related to the COVID pandemic and government overreach during the pandemic. Why don't you tell us a little bit about some of the cases that we brought in the last year that related to government overreach related to COVID?
So I'll just tick through them really quickly because we have a bunch. The first is that we challenged the federal government's hotel quarantine measures, and we did successfully obtain a compassionate exemption for people leaving Canada for medical treatment or for compassionate reasons, which wasn't there initially.
Compassionate reasons would be, for example, if you needed to leave to attend a funeral in another country or attend someone's medical care. An exemption that actually existed if you needed to enter Canada for one of those reasons, but for some reason you couldn't leave Canada for those reasons without needing to quarantine in these hotels.
Correct. So the other case we were involved in was we intervened in a challenge on behalf of Toronto International Celebration Church, which is a church that was a huge facility and was very conscientious about physical distancing and everything like that, but would have had to limit their services severely under the Ontario stay-at-home measure. And we just recognized that freedom of religion is a fundamental freedom, and we intervened to make that point. Once the stay-at-home order was lifted, that was abandoned. Another case that I thought was really effective was we represented a lone protester who's protesting the lockdown measures. He was a small business owner protesting the measures outside of Kingston City Hall by himself, masked, was still ticketed by the police. And so we took his case and we successfully had the Crown withdraw all of the charges at an early stage. And then there was some great advocacy that you, Christine, did, I have to say, in Manitoba, in terms of Manitoba had a vaccine passport policy with no medical exemptions. And you worked with an individual in the province and heard about her case and wrote about her case. She had received a first dose of the Pfizer vaccine and had developed some pretty severe symptoms. And she was just an example of the rare but serious medical cases that can come up. And Manitoba successfully did create a process for medical exemptions just from that letter.
And that woman, by the way, does have a medical exemption now to the proof of vaccine policy. So she's had a good result.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe we'll talk a bit later about other provinces and what they're doing on that same issue. And then finally, of course, I think for me personally, when I think about like the psychological natter of the whole pandemic, it was April 2021 in Ontario when Doug Ford announced new stay-at-home measures, closing playgrounds, and most disturbingly, new police powers that the police could basically stop you and ask you why you were outside of your home. And so we were immediate and vocally in opposition to that. And of course, we weren't the only ones, and those were walked back within about 24 hours.
Yeah, I think that was probably for me the low point of the pandemic, when I was told I wasn't allowed to go to a playground with my young son. It was really distressing, and I think a lot of civil liberties organizations pushed back against that. And I'm pleased that there was the result, but I'm distraught when I read in the newspaper that the Attorney General had actually raised the unconstitutionality of that proposal at Cabinet. these very disturbing trends that we're seeing across the country about politicians just totally ignoring the content of our Constitution and ignoring their responsibility to protect our fundamental rights. Just underscores how important it is for organizations like the Canadian Constitution Foundation to exist and do the work that we do. Now, one thing I wanted to mention before we have this next break, we have about a minute, is there's on the horizon, we have a case involving freedom of expression and a woman in Ontario who had put up a flag in front of her house. What can you tell us briefly about that case?
So it's a working mom who has a sign that has an obscenity, F Trudeau. Hopefully we can say that. And the town of Port Colborne, where she lives, requested she take down the sign, not on an obscenity basis. You're allowed to have obscene political criticism, but on the basis that it interfered with zoning laws and sight lines and things like that. And we just said, absolutely not. It's her right to express her opinion about the prime minister. It's her property, and she has a right to fly that flag. And so we will be appealing the town's decision.
So I think that issue is worthy of a whole episode. It was a flag she put outside, and you have a right to criticize the government using whatever words you choose. I might not choose to use those words, but certainly our politicians right now, very worthy of criticism. When we come back from this commercial break, let's chat more about what is on the horizon for 2022. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're chatting with Joanna Baron from the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the same charity I work at, about some of the cases we're looking forward to in 2022. Now, one of the mandates of our organization is to work on issues related to property rights. And there's a really important case that we're participating in the Supreme Court in February of this year related to property rights. And what can you tell me about that, Joanna?
Yeah, so the case is called Annapolis v. Halifax, and it concerns a corporation which owns a piece of land in Halifax, which the city has started treating basically as a park, putting up signs, in informal ways, preventing the company from developing the land. And so it raises the question of, is this a de facto expropriation? i.e., if the government does something that effectively prevents you from developing or enjoying your land, ought they not have to pay compensation? And the test in the law right now is very unfavorable to property owners. It's really difficult to show de facto expropriation, which would give right to a claim for damages. And so we're intervening to clarify that test and make it really fair for property owners.
Yeah, because normally if the government takes your property, they need to compensate you for what they've taken. But if they've kind of used these sneaky maneuvers, as they seem to have in this Annapolis case, they're saying we don't need to compensate you, even though we're not allowing you to develop the property which you were supposed to be able to develop. So I'm really looking forward to that case. There's another case that we're working on in British Columbia related to COVID and the proof of vaccination policies in that province. What can you tell us briefly about that case?
Yeah, so British Columbia has been the most draconian in terms of, from the outset, initially they said there would be no medical exemptions to the vaccine passport policy. They subsequently, reneged a little bit and said that there would be some very limited categories, but no process for reconsideration. For example, if your physician determined that you were medically unable to be vaccinated and it didn't fit into these preset categories, there would be no process for review. So we're seeking to have a judge review this entire policy. We have several applicants who have very serious, very concrete medical reasons why they cannot be vaccinated. For example, one teenage girl who developed pericarditis, which is a known but rare side effect of the Pfizer vaccine. And so we're seeking to have just a fair and constitutionally compliant process for seeking medical exemptions to the vaccine passport policy.
Yeah, under the current policy, this teenage girl would be permitted, could apply for an exemption and be granted it, but it's on an event-by-event basis. So anytime she wanted to go out to a restaurant, for example, that requires proof of vaccination, she couldn't do anything spur of the moment. She would need to apply each time, which it's just a ludicrous policy. It just doesn't make sense. And this girl has one of the most recognized, albeit rare, side effects of vaccination, which for most people are safe and effective to take, but in her case, it's not safe to take. One of the other things I wanted to chat with you briefly about is a mission that we have on public education. What are we doing in the coming year to educate people about their fundamental freedoms in Canada?
Well, so in addition to everything that you and I do on a day-to-day basis, writing op-eds, speaking to the media, analyzing the policies of the day, we also have built over the last year, with the help of our amazing summer intern, Chantal Bellavance, a constitutional law course, which outlines the fundamental structure of the Constitution, the protected freedoms, the structure of the Constitution, and how these rights actually interact with your everyday life. We have recruited some of the most decorated and accomplished, brilliant legal academics in the country, lawyers in the country, to really talk in a nuanced but also, non-jargonish way about the Constitution and how it protects Canadians. It's going to be available on our website this month for free.
Yeah, free, and you can do it at your own pace. Anyone who registers at the ccf.ca will be able to find out more about that. That's all the time we have today. Joanna, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks, Christine.
We've heard today about the work of the Canadian Constitution Foundation, the legal charity that I work for, which is one of Canada's leading voices protecting fundamental freedoms. I hope that you found the work we do as exciting and cutting edge as I do. It's a great privilege for me to get to do the work we do at the CTF, work that very few people in Canada do, and it's also a great privilege for me to get to tell you about it today. If you believe in a freer Canada, civil liberties, and protecting fundamental freedoms, visit the ccf.ca, where you can learn all about our cases and subscribe to our freedom updates to stay in the loop. That's all for today. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.